Senator Dagenais on debate. You can hear me? Okay. Senators, I'd like to indicate, like many of my colleagues, that I will vote against the Emergencies Act, which is a violation of fundamental rights and an appropriation of powers by a prime minister who has once again demonstrated his inability to govern democratically and transparently. Far be it from me to say that the demonstration in front of Parliament should not have been stopped, but a demonstration that degenerated because of the Prime Minister's inaction and incompetence is definitely not what we call a threat to the security of our country. Inappropriate things on billboards or social media should not be the basis for invoking an Emergencies Act. Otherwise, we'd be in continual use of the Emergencies Act. The Prime Minister, it became more of a threat to his public image and his image within his caucus. There is no reason today, for the first time in history, that this law passed to address the real threat to our national security, a law that contains clear conditions of enforcement that have never been met by the current government. This act, which was made available to the Parliament of Canada in 1988, contains strict rules that were adopted to ensure that no government repeats the abuses committed during the October crisis of 1970, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the current Prime Minister's father, invoked the War Measures Act of the day. One of the safeguards of the 1988 Emergency Measures Act is the requirement for the federal government of the day to consult with the provincial governments in advance. It's quite easy to see from the reaction of some of the country's premiers that no consultation worthy of the name has taken place. This lack of consultation shows us how much the first Trudeau's son despises, just as his father was able to do, the democratic rules, provincial jurisdictions, and the fundamental rights of citizens who do not think like him. An illegal occupation of a downtown area by truckers is not an insurrection, even less so when there are no reports of violence from those who just wanted to be heard. They were just angry citizens. The government and the Senate of Canada do not have to adapt against them laws and methods worthy of certain dictatorships. It was just necessary to act at the right time to avoid that this state of siege on the Parliament Hill stretch over 3 weeks. But let's get back to the content of the 1988 Emergency Measures Act. Fellow senators, there is no need to have an Emergencies Act to dismantle barricades, arrest a few recalcitrant parties, and tow some trucks. You just need a leader at the head of the country able to take responsibility at the right time to prevent the situation from getting out of hand. To have recourse to this act, the government had to show there was no other option. But where was Prime Minister Trudeau in the first 2 weeks of the protest? What did he do to dialogue and calm down the angry truckers? Nothing, absolutely nothing. Justin Trudeau chose to remain hidden in his cottage, and worse, he threw oil on the fire by his provocative remarks towards the demonstrators, calling them complainers. Unfortunately, I see, and I hope you're able to see as I do, that the leadership that a true statesman must have is not part of Justin Trudeau's DNA. Rather than dialogue, Justin Trudeau prefers to dictate. Today, I am certainly a senator, but I'm also a former police officer who lived on the barricades during the Oka crisis, where violence was definitely more present than on Wellington Street in Ottawa. And no one in 1990 called for the adoption of the Emergency Measures Act to resolve the conflict. It was not even necessary to have the armed forces intervene and support the police. Dialogue and mediation allowed us to fix the situation. In addition to the Oka crisis in recent years, there was the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City, G20 in Toronto, G7 in Charlevoix, where police services were able to counter professional international demonstrators, and I mean professional international demonstrators, without having to resort to the Emergency Measures Act. I am repeating myself in the reflection we are doing. A demonstration is not an insurrection. To tell us that the police needed the Emergencies Act to deal with trucker protests is to lie to us. A quick review of the police powers clearly shows that all police departments involved in the trucking movements had all the powers to intervene, even the power to requisition tow trucks to seize and move the trucks that were on Wellington Street. Why didn't they act? There will definitely need to be a review of the chronology of decisions that were made. That will come once the dust settles, at least I hope. But the powers that were needed 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, and last week ago did exist in the current laws of the land without the need for a bludgeoning law like the Emergency Measures Act. What I'm telling you is so true that even before the Trudeau government put this law in place, police were able to peacefully clear the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit and the Coutts border crossing in Alberta. How and why? First of all, how? By simply making our police officers apply the laws. Why? Because the non-visible command of these operations of the Ambassador Bridge and Coutts were assumed by the President of the United States and not the Prime Minister of Canada. In short, Joe Biden's leadership was enough for Canadian police to take action. It's worth noting that the economic stakes were high for the Americans, and that was certainly a major factor in the speed of the border intervention. Here in Canada, economic issues are unfortunately too often ignored to make room for partisan liberal political issues. In this regard, how can we not remember the facts that date back only 2 years? As recently as February 2020, Prime Minister Trudeau clearly demonstrated his lack of concern for Canada's economy by not intervening in the blockade of rail lines by Wet'suwet'en communities and their supporters in British Columbia, Belleville, Ontario, and St. Lambert, Quebec. The economic consequences of the 2020 demonstrations were much more serious than those on Wellington Street. Tens of thousands of citizens were unable to get to work each day, and CN had to cancel services and lay off hundreds of employees because of rail blockade by pipeline opponents. All this went on for weeks without Prime Minister Trudeau implementing the Emergency Measures Act, while his Transport Minister, Marc Garneau, claimed it would derail the country's economy. Let's ask ourselves why. Let's also ask ourselves if there are not two categories of protesting citizens in Canada, because if I remember correctly, Prime Minister Trudeau, barely a week after the blockades began, appointed Minister Mark Miller to go and listen to the grievances of the representatives of the Aboriginal communities. In 2020, just 2 years ago, the government listened and refused to intervene by force to put an end to the blockades of the railroads by advocating dialogue. Did you hear about any dialogue with the truckers who were blocking Wellington Street? I don't. And yet, this is an essential prerequisite for implementing the Emergency Measures Act. Facing the truckers' demonstration, where was Justin Trudeau after 1 week? Where was he after 2 weeks? Let's ask ourselves the questions. Let's ask ourselves how much credibility we should give him today when he comes and tells us that he's acting to respond to the urgency of the situation. I talked about the lack of leadership. Now we can talk about political incoherence, most certainly when comparing the blockages of 2020 and this year. I am inclined to believe that Liberal MP Joe Lightbound is right when he says that his government is doing everything possible to instrumentalize the COVID-19 crisis by dividing citizens for partisan political purposes. And let me tell you, the number of people who share my opinion on this subject is growing rapidly. Let me turn to another issue that the Trudeau government has raised as a reason to use the Emergency Measures Act. The hidden and foreign financing of the demonstrators. The government says that Canadian police should be allowed to counter foreign funding of protest organizers in Canada by giving them the power to seize their bank accounts. Frankly, it's distressing to hear that, because it's like saying publicly that CSIS and FinTrack weren't doing their jobs before the Emergency Measures Act was put in place. Our intelligence services are well connected with their American counterparts and surely had on a daily basis all the information necessary about the situation. But their legendary and necessary discretion about their working methods will never allow us to know everything about the reality of the financial threat alleged and instrumentalized by the Prime Minister in the reasons he invoked to have the recourse to the Emergency Measures Act. And if I'm not right about our intelligence services being very effective, it's high time we took action to strengthen their powers. Unfortunately, from the Prime Minister, that's not what I heard and understood from the extensive testimony before the Senate Committee on National Defense and National Security, where I've served for 10 years.
Let's talk about the RCMP seizure of firearms, which is part of the Liberal political argument for using the Emergencies Act. According to the RCMP, the guns seized at the border were destined for truckers in Alberta. First, I draw your attention to the fact that the seizure could have been made by the RCMP without the Emergencies Act. But more importantly, I want you to remember that at no time did the government of the day demonstrate to us that these weapons could be used to overthrow the government by force. There cannot be a serious allegation of insurgency merely because weapons have been seized at the border. On that basis, I strongly suggest that the government direct the police to position themselves effectively around the Akwesasne Mohawk Reserve, where they could easily intercept weekly truckloads of illegal weapons coming into Canada. But Prime Minister Trudeau is not bothered by these weapons coming into the country. They're only being used by organized crime gangs who murder teenagers in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. Where is he hiding when the police ask him to legislate handguns? Probably in his cottage. Now, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about surveillance that should be exercised over the Emergencies Act, an essential part of the law enacted in 1988. Striking an independent committee to inquire into the use of the Act 60 days after its adoption and report to Parliament and the Senate within 360 days. That's what the law says. That's all well and good, but how can we trust that the Prime Minister will allow a full independent audit of the situation? Remember that this is the same Prime Minister who in August 2020 prorogued the other chamber, shutting down 3 committees looking into his government's questionable funding of We Charity. Just that raises a doubt in my mind. Transparency is not a value of the Liberal Party of Canada and its leader, Justin Trudeau. There's a lack of transparency, and it also refused to commit to take part in our committee of the whole here in this chamber. We're here to adopt a bill that has no reason to be, especially now that Wellington Street is clear. For me, the Emergencies Act before us is nothing more than a symbol of the weakness of the Prime Minister in office, who is trying to salvage his image by any means, including dragging his feet on this file and on all the major files on his desk. A few examples for those who might be tempted to think I'm exaggerated. The blockade of the railways by the Wet'suwet'en communities in 2020. Foot dragging. The policy on Huawei's possible interference with our national security. Foot dragging. Taxing the GAFAMs. Foot dragging. Still no ambassador in Paris. Foot dragging. Renewing the outdated equipment of our armed forces and drinking water in Indigenous communities. Still foot dragging. I'll stop there. But are we surprised to see that it is still foot dragging that allows this Prime Minister to try to shove a law reserved for extraordinary situations down our throats, which should definitely not be needed for a truckers' demonstration that could have been turned away without special legislation after a few days of occupation? Senators, it is our duty to resist the political and legislative abuses of a Prime Minister who has been ineffective in a situation requiring leadership, openness to discussion, and a measure of firmness. Canada deserves better than a Prime Minister who wants to run the country from the comfort of his cottage. As a senator, I don't want to go down in history for approving this act, as NDP members did last night in the other chamber, holding their nose as they did so. If it weren't for the NDP's nauseating complicity, this act would not even be here before us today. Thank you very much.